Welcome back, fiber friends, to another episode of the Wool to Gold podcast. My name is Brian, and today we are going to be learning to make bouclé yarn. If you had joined us for our last episode about supercoils, then you are in good shape to start this episode. Supercoils and bouclés are actually not that far from each other. Once you have sort of a intermittent supercoil, you just need a binder thread and then you are on your way to a bouclé yarn. Before I actually show you guys the process of spinning it though, I did want to talk about all of the components of a bouclé yarn and how material type can really impact your outcome on this one. As you can clearly see, bouclé is one of my favorite art yarns. I just think that the way it ends up looking, no matter if you use wool, mohair, or cotton, like I did on the one on the end, they really come out absolutely beautiful, super textured. I tend to do mine with thread as both the core and the binder so that I have the option to add beads if I want, but obviously you can mess around with spinning the core or the binder yourself if you want to. Most bouclés are going to be 3-ply yarns. There are some that are 4-ply if you want to give it like an extra bouclé, extra loopy, fluffy look to it. However, in most cases, they're going to be 3 plies. As I mentioned, you're going to have the core ply, which you're going to wrap your looping singles around, and then you're going to use the binder to set them into place to accomplish that bouclé. So that's 3 different plies. Personally, I really only like to spin one of them because we are sending the yarn through the wheel a number of times, just like when we do core yarns in general or super coils. You're gonna want to use a core thread that can hold up to being twisted and untwisted. So something super thick or low twist is not going to work as a core or a binder in this case. And then we're going to take one final look at all of our elements before we get started, and I'm going to talk a little bit about them and how we're going to bring them together. So obviously this is the bouclé that I spun before. I actually used some cotton thread that this is in a ball. However, it is the same thread that is on this cone. The reason this one's in a ball is because I have added twists to this, which I do think if you want the bouclé yarn possible, that adding a little bit of extra twist to the thread, it can go a long way, I'm just saying. And then here are the singles that I spun from. I bought these 2 braids together. It's a Tencel wool blend that I've actually really enjoyed spinning. It's honestly a dream to spin, which I don't usually say about things like Tencel, but I really enjoyed this blend, clearly, because I'm making this yarn again. But this time around, we are going to be adding beads. So I have my little bead collection right here, and I have some leftover pearls, and then wooden star beads, and then clear glass seed beads that I'm just gonna, like, intermittently scatter in this yarn. However, I personally really like to add the beads on the last ply. The reason for this is because beads can get caught up in the wheel as it's feeding, like, onto the bobbin. Not always, but with some like chunkier beads. And so to mitigate this and to make it so that there's less labor involved, I'm going to add them last, right? Because why make them get caught in the feed-in, in the orifice, or in the hooks that lead onto the bobbin? Why let it get caught twice when you can just let it get caught once? You know what I mean? So we're going to start plying this. Again, I highly recommend, if you haven't seen my Supercoil tutorial, even though these are very different yarns at the end of the day, a lot of tips in the Supercoil tutorial will help you with plying this, because this is essentially a modified intermittent supercoil where we end up plying it back and adding a 3rd ply to help sort of lock those little loops and coils into place. Once again, today we're going to be using Marion, my shacked matchless. The reason for this today is because bouclé tends to like fluff up, right? Because it has all that texture, and I want to fit as much of this yarn on a single bobbin as possible because I really don't like to split splice. I don't like to join 2 bouclé yarns because it often just doesn't like work out. I end up just having to make them separate skeins anyway. So I want to try to fit as much as possible on a single bobbin, and there's no doubt that my shacked, its standard bobbin size, is one of the only bobbins on the market, in my opinion, that actually holds 4 ounces. Again, I don't sell these wheels. I got this secondhand. I'm just telling you this information because I think it's helpful. Today we are going to be using I'm not sure, I think I'm going to go with a 9. I think I'm going to go with a 9-to-1 ratio, a little bit faster than our Supercoil, just because personally, bouclés are a very high labor yarn, okay? If you're a bouclé enthusiast like myself, it's definitely worth it, but there's a reason that handspun bouclé is one of the most expensive handspun yarns that you can procure in terms of art yarns. It's just so high labor. There's just a lot of work of the plying and the adjusting of the loops and the plying it again and all of that stuff. And so ideally I would like to go as fast as I possibly can while still being able to show you guys the process. So again, we're gonna go 9-to-1 for the ratio. I might rack it up later, but I think we're probably gonna stick to 9-to-1. And then the last note that I have before we get started today is, just like all of these art yarns, right? You're spinning them. You are the spinner. So if you take a look at this yarn and you say, well, I like my bouclés to be even loopier, or vice versa, you're like, I like my bouclés to be a little bit more consistent and controlled and not super loopy. Okay, you can adjust them for your preference. How you're going to achieve each of these is you're either going to add even more intermittent supercoils while you're doing this stage of plying, and again, I'll show you an example of that, or you're going to do less of them. Another thing to keep in mind about bouclés is, especially during this first plying cycle, right? As long as you have an adequate number of loops worked into your, and like intermittent coils worked into your singles plied with your core, you're fine. Okay, if it's not necessarily dispersed along the yarn in the right way yet, that's totally fine. In fact, I always say don't waste your time really adjusting where the loops are or how evenly the loops are dispersed on this first plying cycle, because it literally does not matter. You are going to adjust them. You are going to adjust them. You are going to adjust them again when it goes through that second plying cycle. Okay, so don't worry about it too much. Don't fret or sweat too much. This is frankly the easy part. It's just a little bit tedious and time consuming. And then one last thing to remind you is, not as drastically as with Supercoil yarns, but very similarly as with Supercoil yarns, we are wrapping singles around a core, so you're probably going to need less core than you expect, and you're probably going to need more singles than you expect to get the yardage that you want. What that essentially means too is, if you have like 300 yards of singles for your bouclé yarn, you're not going to end up with 300 yards of bouclé. For this part of the plying, I do like to generally put my singles on my right side and my ball of thread or my cone of thread or whatever I'm using as the core on my left side. But a general reminder once again that if you are a lefty, you might want to switch those. And then this is what I mean by intermittently supercoiling it. So essentially this is very similar to like a classic thread ply, at least the beginnings of it. But every once in a while, you're going to be scrunching and bunching your loops so that when we send this back through with the binder, these will open up and create our loops. So do keep in mind, this is going to be like a fine wool bouclé because we used wool, obviously. But if you want more open loops, you are going to maybe change your material type. So traditionally for that more like open loop, what I would call almost old school bouclé, those old school like mohair bouclés that you saw in the 90s and 80s, if you want to accomplish that, you're going to use mohair as opposed to using like a fine wool like I did here. Now, if you're thinking, well, what if, Brian, I supercoiled the entire thing? Would that make like the ultimate bouclé? The answer is no. I have tried that. The answer is no. If you watch here, when I let it enter at sort of a 90-degree angle, at least in my opinion, this spiral is a little bit more pronounced and they're a little bit easier to move about. If you let the two ply sort of enter at a similar angle, you're going to get closer to a traditional thread ply. Nothing wrong with that. You can still absolutely move the loops up and down. It just might not be as loopy. It's much later in the day. It's nighttime. In fact, it is snowing outside. I am trying to wash and dye the Santa Cruz Island fleece and also get this tutorial done. So this is the 2-ply that I have, and then I also already loaded on the beads that I'm gonna do. As you can see, I used all the clear seed beads I had left, which was like 7, which is not a lot, and then wooden star beads and pearls. Obviously they're fake pearls, but still, you know, it's gonna look great. And I'm gonna show you guys how we ply this up and how it becomes a boucle, and how you can kind of adjust the loops to make the best boucle for you. Just like last time, I'm going to have my thread on my left side and my 2-ply on my right side, just because that's my preference, that's how I like to control it, but you can mess around to see what you prefer. And then one last thing before we actually start the plying process that I did want to mention is that when I made this 2-ply, I spun it in the clockwise direction, so when I'm plying it with my binder, I am going to spin it counterclockwise in order to get the boucle effect. Again, it is up to you and your preference if you want to switch those around. Just keep that in mind if you're referencing this tutorial later on. Just like in the Supercoil tutorial, I am going to offer you guys multiple views of this plying process. I'm also going to offer essentially some more extended footage of this plying process, because I think it's important to acknowledge that even for an experienced spinner, even for someone like me who is consistently making yarns that I'm very happy with, this is still a yarn that just like takes a lot of time. It's just a little bit tedious. It's kind of just part of it. And I don't want you to think that this happens overnight. It really is going to take some time. Now, if you watch what I'm doing right now, you can see that I am adjusting the loops to be a little bit more condensed on the boucle yarn. This is not 100% necessary if you don't want to do it, just like how adding beads is not 100% necessary either, but I am going to illustrate how you do that now. So as you can see, it's really just about figuring out where you want to place the bead and then putting it there and plying. It's not really any more complicated than that. As I mentioned earlier in the tutorial, you do have to make sure the beads are on the thread beforehand, but otherwise you just start plying and then you kind of just start to let them go as you want to disperse them along the yarn. I always try to make sure to add more beads than I think I'm going to want or need, because I'd rather have beads left over than have a bunch of yarns at the very end of the yarn that don't have any beads at all. I am going to add in timestamps to this tutorial so that if you want to skip to the different point of view or the different angle / perspective to get a better idea of the plying and what it looks like, you have that option. The last thing that I wanted to mention, that in a lot of references that I see for boucle yarn, it recommends doing this binding ply at about a 45-degree angle. I don't necessarily know if I agree with that or if I necessarily get the best or most ideal boucle results when I do that, but obviously you can mess around with the plying angle a little bit and see what works best for you. A lot of you mentioned in the last art yarn video that you really liked this perspective and you didn't really care that the screen wasn't necessarily horizontal. You just appreciated this particular angle or view of the yarn plying, so I decided to include it in this video as well. And then once again, I'm going to show you what I meant earlier when I said you can adjust the loops on a boucle. If you go to ply it and you have one section that is lacking loops and another section that is too loopy, you can undo it and sort of more evenly disperse them along the way to get the ideal boucle yarn. Obviously, you don't have to do this. There are plenty of people who kind of just roll with the way their boucle yarn comes out. I just personally like to make like really condensed and cushy boucle yarn, and this is how I do it. And here we finally have the finished bobbin of Bouclé yarn. As you can see, it's super loopy and super textured. Now it's time to take it off of the bobbin and put it onto a Knotty to essentially just hang it up. But before we do that, we are going to wash this yarn. I'm not going to thwack it for a few different reasons. I don't tend to thwack my Bouclé yarns because of all of those loops and things like that and all that texture. It has enough texture. We don't need to emphasize the texture on this in any way, shape, or form. I don't want to disrupt the loops too much. And then in addition with the beads, when you thwack beads, you do have to be careful. Depending on what material they're made out of, they can crack and come out of the yarn, obviously, if you're too rough with it. So I tend to just not thwack beaded yarns in general. That's just a personal preference, but obviously you can choose to do differently. And here you can see, here it is off of the Knitty Knotty. I'm glowing. Like, I think this turned out perfect, even better honestly than the last one. It's super squishy and airy. I think that the little beads really do add even more interest to this skein. And I named it after the last one. So it's Aquarium City 2. It is a 3-ply. It is about 48 yards. And if you're interested in this skein, it is going to end up on the shop sometime very soon. As always, thank you so much for watching. Don't forget to comment down below on the next art yarn that you want to see or your favorite one so far. I know I've put out a few of them, so if you have been enjoying them, don't forget to leave a little comment below. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and we'll see you guys on the next one.